Future Bleed, a Twilight Zone story by Daniel Vaughn.
Rick Vaughn is a man out of time, a whisperer on waves the world has long since abandoned. In a modern age of fiber optics and viral trends, he clings to copper wire and dials, scanning the air not for present voices but for echoes of something deeper. But tonight, in a lakeside attic beneath the East Texas sky, Rick Vaughn will intercept not an echo but a warning, a message bleeding through time, a broadcast only he can hear on a frequency known only to the Twilight Zone.
Rick Vaughn wasn't a survivalist or a conspiracy nut. He was just a retired software engineer who had spent decades building invisible systems, firmware for pacemakers, database tools for municipal governments, network monitors used by hospitals and airports. He'd always worked behind the curtain, thinking in logic, trees, and cycles, trusting in pattern and code. When Rick left the industry at 70, he didn't turn to fishing or golf. He returned to a hobby from his childhood: ham radio. There was something reassuring about analog technology, something he could touch, tune, repair with a soldering iron instead of a patch update. He and his wife, Karen, lived in a black shingled house on the edge of a lake just outside Woodville, Texas. The lake shimmered like glass in the mornings, and the pine forest stretched out in every direction like green waves. Karen filled their home with warmth, pies cooling on windowsills, gospel music humming low from the record player, bird feeders she insisted the raccoons would never figure out. Rick's workshop was in the attic, surrounded by aging transceivers, oscilloscopes, yellowing maps, and notebooks filled with frequency logs. His rig was old but beautiful, a 1958 Collins ham radio set, polished and humming like a living thing. His call sign, K05L, hung proudly over the desk. Most nights were quiet. He might catch a trucker outside Lubbock or a skywatcher in Arizona, but mostly it was noise. Still, he listened. That's what he did. Listening was his language. On Tuesday, October 18th, Rick was sweeping near 15,000 megahertz when something clean sliced through the static.
This is WHG 9 Evening Broadcast. It's 7:02 p.m., Friday, October 21st, and here are your headlines.
Rick paused. It wasn't Friday. He checked his clock. Tuesday, 8:01 p.m. He leaned in. The woman's voice was confident, smooth, exactly the sort of tone used on national radio.
In sports, the Yankees beat the Mariners 6-4. In international news, the Geneva Accord has collapsed after days of closed-door negotiation. And in weather, a meteor strike is projected late Friday night in Tyler County, near Woodville, Texas.
Rick sat bolt upright. The feed ended abruptly. No sign-off, no static, just silence. He rewound the signal on his old tape deck and played it back. It wasn't a loop, not some shortwave pirate broadcast. The quality was too sharp. The station WHG-9 didn't exist. He went downstairs and sat with Karen while she finished a crossword. He stared at the lake through the window, unsure if he should say anything. That night he didn't sleep. On Wednesday at the same time, the voice returned.
October 22nd. Cleanup continues in the aftermath of the meteor strike that devastated Tyler County. FEMA has issued a disaster response order, citing over 4,000 estimated casualties. Lake Terrace is reported vaporized by the blast. Power grids in Woodville and surrounding areas remain offline.
Rick's hands trembled. He pulled out maps, calculated distances, cross-checked the National Weather Service. Nothing. The meteor didn't exist yet. He called the Tyler County Sheriff. The woman who answered chuckled. If NASA says there's no rock coming, I'm going to take their word over a guy with a walkie-talkie. The next day, Rick drove into town and visited the mayor's office. The intern at the front desk took his USB stick with a smirk and said they'd pass it along. At home, Rick tried to show Karen. He played the tape. She listened. Then she said, "Rick, if you're right, what do we do?" "We leave," he said. "Tonight." She didn't argue. She lived with him long enough to know that when his voice got quiet like that, something was happening behind his eyes, something precise and serious and beyond debate. She packed a bag. He packed his radio. They left the lake house at 10:12 p.m. on Friday night and drove north toward the city of Longview. The entire way, Rick was on his radio, trying to warn anyone who would listen that they needed to leave now. He received few responses, and on the off chance someone did, they usually laughed at him as if it was a joke. They pulled off the road just past a weathered Baptist church, the steeple a jagged silhouette against the low-hanging stars. Rick killed the headlights. The world outside their windshield was utterly still. There was no wind, no bird song, and no hint of anything coming. Karen sat curled in the passenger seat, a blanket around her shoulders. Rick was hunched over the ham rig in the back seat, headphones on, listening for any last fragment of the impossible station. But the broadcast had ended minutes ago. The air was heavy with something neither of them could name. Rick looked at his watch. 2:12 a.m. Karen whispered, "Do you think we're far enough away?" The broadcast said it was confined to Tyler County. "We are 3 counties over." But Rick seemed unsure if it was far enough. 2:13 a.m. At first, it was a subtle change in the darkness. The black sky over Tyler County began to glow faintly, like backlit ash. The pine tree line beyond the fields took on a dull outline, as if a second dawn was stirring beneath the earth. Then, without warning, the sky split open. A blinding white arc, like lightning turned solid, ripped down from the heavens at an impossible angle. It looked alive, writhing and burning as it fell, dragging with it a tail of fire and rock that left a bruise across the stars. Karen gasped and covered her mouth. Rick just stared, jaw clenching. The meteor hit somewhere near Lake Tejas. For a moment that seemed both instant and infinite, the world seemed to stop breathing. There was a flicker, brief and unreal, like the universe skipped a frame. And then came the blast, not a single explosion, but a rolling concussion that cracked the ground beneath their truck and made their ears throb. The forest swayed violently, as if pushed by God's hand. Birds erupted from the trees in chaotic spirals. The windshield flexed inward with a groan. Dust and pine needles rained from the trees like a green hailstorm. A fireball rose over the hills. It mushroomed upward into the sky, a pillar of red and gold boiling against the stars. A low, dry gasp escaped Karen's throat. Rick placed a hand on her knee. The light lingered far too long. It flickered like a dying furnace, casting the landscape in hues of orange and shadow. The once familiar woods looked alien now, haunted by a glow that felt both prehistoric and apocalyptic. When the fire finally dimmed, smoke and debris lifted into the stratosphere in an enormous column. Then came the wind. It arrived in a sudden, ripping gust that screamed through the trees and howled across the fields, carrying with it the smell of scorched soil, vaporized pine, and melted steel. The sound was unlike anything Rick had ever heard, deeper than thunder, but still ear-splitting like gunfire. Karen wept softly beside him. "All of our friends." For several long minutes, the earth exhaled its grief. Then the silence returned. But it was not the same silence that had come before. This silence knew what it had witnessed, what had just happened. Rick leaned back in the driver's seat and stared out over the blackened horizon. And in the distance, where their lake had once glistened, where cities had glowed and flickered like jewels, there was only darkness. They stayed until dawn. The few words they spoke were more in prayer than to one another. In the following days, Woodville was erased. The crater was a mile wide. The lake house and the lake were gone. FEMA called it the worst meteor impact in Texas history. No one had seen it coming. NASA quietly apologized and made some excuse about it being an unobserved astral body. But some people remembered. Operators from Maine to New Mexico reported hearing a broadcast from someone named Rick, transmitting coordinates, pleading with anyone who would listen. Others said they'd heard a woman's voice giving the news before it happened. A conspiracy theory grew around the idea of future bleed, signals slipping between timelines like leaky faucets. The FCC dismissed it. WHG-9 remained untraceable. No recordings could be authenticated. Rick and Karen moved to a cabin outside Livingston. It was a quiet cabin near a creek. Rick did build a new antenna, but was now less enthused about his once favorite hobby. Rick boxed up the Collins radio and put it in the attic. But sometimes on cool nights he would sit by the window with a transistor balanced on his knee, listening, not expecting to hear anything, but knowing if it came again, he'd be ready.
Rick Vaughn heard the future, tried to stop it, In the end, he did what few people ever manage. He listened well enough to escape what was coming. But the future, once heard, never truly leaves. It echoes in memory, in static, in silence. Because sometimes truth travels not by light, but by air, on waves that pass through walls, hearts, and time itself. And when it does, it arrives with no warning, except in the Twilight Zone.